Good day. Before I get into the information, the basic matters that I'm going to discuss in this video, I want to return again to the topic of my friend Gonzalo Lira, who remains under arrest in Ukraine on a nebulous charge, the nature of which I don't fully understand. I've talked about this at great length for some time in previous programs. You can go back and see what I've said, but in summary, I don't see that these charges, which apparently are going to be brought against him, have the slightest merit, and I don't even understand the nature of the case, given that he is not a Ukrainian citizen and that he has not taken any step that could conceivably undermine the war effort, in Ukraine's war effort, and given that he has no access to classified information and has never sought that information, it makes no sense to consider him any sort of spy or someone engaging in anything which could be considered espionage. So I've already made those points clear. I've already made clear my concerns about the fact of his arrest. But I want to touch on two matters today about his case. The first is that it is now some weeks since I've heard anything of him. I know about his arrest because the Ukrainian authorities have confirmed that he has indeed been arrested. As I said, they issued that statement which detailed the case against him, such as it is, but since then there's been nothing. I don't know where he is, what kind of place of detention he's been kept in, whether his family have been contacted and have been informed about that, whether his family are in contact with him, or whether he has legal representation. And that is concerning. Generally speaking, when a person is arrested, one would expect information about them to be public and accessible, not kept secret in the way that seems to be the case with Gonzalo. That's the first thing to say. The second relates to a message I've had, a private message from a long-standing viewer who has suggested that it's possible that one of the purposes behind the arrest of Gonzalo is to try to exchange him for some of the American citizens who are held in Russia. Well, I have to say, if that is the case, it's both utterly wrong and completely illogical. If, as I believe, Gonzalo is an American citizen, then an American citizen held by Ukraine would be exchanged for American citizens held by Russia, if that is indeed the purpose of this operation. Now, that already shows the unethical nature of this transaction. If such it is, the United States would presumably be colluding in the exchange of one of its own people, handing out the handover of one of its own people in return for others of its people, which I have to say, I cannot imagine any government ever agreeing to do. But the other piece of illogic in this whole construct is that it is impossible for me to see why the Russians would agree to exchange him in that kind of way. He's not, after all, one of their citizens. He's not working for them. He's not done anything at all that, as I said, impacts on Ukraine's war effort. All he has done is that he's lived in Kharkiv and done what is his right, gone into the public space and expressed his opinions and his views. Why would the Russians be interested in him? I have to say, if this is the plan, it's both unethical and it is stupid. It is not going to achieve the purpose which it would presumably have. But that brings me now to the next point, which is, again, I've heard no word that the US government has been taking any steps at all, either to obtain consular access to Gonzalo or to arrange legal representation for him, or to keep his family informed about his condition and whereabouts, or any of these things. And I would reiterate again that if Gonzalo is an American citizen, as I believe, then that is the United States' obligation. And I would just say one further thing. I am not an American citizen, so there's very little I can do in this matter over and above what I'm doing at the moment, making these comments on this program. But I would say, if you are an American citizen, and this is a lot to ask, people are busy, they often don't have much time on their hands, they've got many things to do, but if you can nonetheless find the time to write to your congressman and inform them about this situation, simply pointing out that Gonzalo appears to be an American citizen, he is being held in detention in Ukraine, try to find out what action, if any, the American authorities are taking on his behalf. Well, I, for one, would be very grateful, and so I think would be members of his family. I know it's a lot to ask. I apologize for asking for it. If I was an American citizen, I would be doing it myself, of course. I have no capacity to do that, but if you can do it, well, God bless you, and that's all I'm going to say. Now, having dealt with the very serious and grave matter of Gonzalo Lira, I'm going to add one other small thing, which is that, unfortunately, yet again, after some weeks of remission, I've seen one or two, it must be said, more sporadic attempts to set up channels bearing my name and to sell on the internet goods which supposedly are being marketed either by me or on my behalf, which I have absolutely nothing to do with. Let me reiterate again what I have said in previous occasions. The only programs, the only channels in which I am directly involved is this one, Alexander Mercouris, which you're watching now, and the Duran. I am not directly involved in any other channel. If you see any channel that purports to be by me, or which is connected to me, and which uses my name to market itself, then of course it is not by me, it has nothing to do with me, and I am extremely unhappy, to say the least, about the fact that such a channel would even exist. The second thing is, again, if you buy goods or services which you imagine, which you're led to believe have some connection to me, and which are not sold by the Duran shop, of which you can find links under this video, well, those goods and services have nothing to do with me, and you are the victim of a fraud. And I want to make that very clear. And if you're being asked to pay for these items in cryptocurrencies, which I have understand has happened on a number of occasions, well, that should ring even more alarm bells. So these channels have nothing to do with me. These goods that are being sold have nothing to do with me either. It's just a case of identity theft and criminal activity. This has been a disillusioning experience. It has shown to me that getting the authorities to take action on this kind of internet fraud is incredibly difficult because of the overwhelming jurisdictional issues. I will say that the platforms that have been misused for these, in connection with these activities, have actually, to my knowledge, taken complaints about them seriously and have acted to take these channels down and to take these bogus shops down as well. But unfortunately, they do crop up from time to time. And when they do, as I said, please steer clear of them. And if you again have the time, report them to the platform and don't have anything further to do with them than that. Anyway, with apologies for taking up your time with these matters. As I said, I do consider the Gonzalo matter to be a serious matter, but as I said, with apologies for doing that, let me now proceed with the substance of my program. And the first thing to say is that we've now had some more news from the battlefronts, and it has become clear that the information that it was the Russians who were on the attack in the Bakhmut, or perhaps I should now say Artyomovsk area, is correct. It seems that the Russians are now launching attacks, carrying out an offensives towards Khromovo and Ivanivska. I expect that Khromovo will fall quite quickly. Ivanivska might take somewhat longer. It is a much more heavily fortified and defendable place. But it does seem that the Russians are on the attack there. So reports that Ukraine was continuing its offensive around Bakhmut, on Bakhmut's flanks, they appear to be wrong. Now, as I said, how quickly this Russian offensive will develop, how serious it is, I am not sure, but personally, I think it is likely, with Russian troops, apparently regular army troops, now apparently pouring into the area to take the place of the Wagner forces, which are due to pull out today, by the way. It's likely, as I said, that with these fresh troops pouring in, this offensive will be pressed. And I personally think, again, this is just my guess, that the Russians, at the very least, will push on to Chasiv Yar if and when they capture Ivanivska. And once they have done that, I expect them to dig in for a while before they push on to Konstantinovka as well. And of course, beyond Konstantinovka, a bigger place than Chasiv Yar, perhaps a rather more defendable place than Chasiv Yar. But once they've taken Konstantinovka, the road, as far as I can see, is open to advance on Kramatorsk, where the big battle, presumably for this town, the last major defense point, alongside its sister city of Slavyansk to the north, the last major defense line before the north and central areas of Donbass are cleared and before the Russian army is able to advance further west to the Dnieper, if that is indeed its plan, as by the way, I expect it is. So that's what's going on, or so it seems to me, on the battlefronts near, well, the Bakhmut, as it was called, Artyomovsk, as the Russians call it. Having said that, there are other reports that tell us that the Ukrainians are now on the counteroffensive. And this comes from Mikhail Podolyak, advisor to Zelensky himself. He's told Italian Rai 1 television on Wednesday that the counteroffensive has continued for several days now. This war stretches for 1,500 kilometers along the border, but certain offensives have already begun. Now, that does beg the question of what he's talking about. As I said, in Bakhmut, at least, or in the area of Bakhmut or Artyomovsk, it's the Russians who appear to be advancing. I've also received news that they've been advancing also in the area of Siversk. There's apparently severe problems for the Ukrainians in the Siversk area. That's in the north, to the north of Bakhmut. well to the north of Bakhmut, in fact. It's the town that the Russians didn't capture following the fall of Lysychansk last summer, but they now seem to be pressing harder there. There's also reports that a settlement called Belogorovka, which has been bitterly fought over in the general area of Seversk, is now semi-encircled by the Russians as well. So where is this offensive that we've just been told about? It does seem a little mysterious, but I wonder whether just possibly what was being mentioned here, this offensive that has been underway for several days, whether Podolyak, what he meant was this attack in Belgorod. Now, I'm not going to analyze it in detail. There has been a lengthy discussion of it, again, by Simplicius the Thinker. And again, I now take an opportunity to correct something that I said about him in the past. I've speculated in the past that he is more than one person, that there's a group of people involved. The reason I thought that is the sheer amount of output that he produces on any one day, which is astonishing. Well, he has now clearly stated that he is one individual, and obviously I accept that, and I offer him my apology for thinking that he is more people than he clearly is. He's one person. He's taking an enormous amount of time. He must be spending hours reading up and getting information about all the things that are going on. And he's writing, as I said, pretty much every day, keeping us all informed of his views and opinions about what is going on in this very complex war. But anyway, Simplicius the Thinker has done a very detailed breakdown of the fight in Belgorod, this, what I called it, the suicide mission. And a number of things have now become apparent, which go beyond some of the things that I'd said before. Firstly, that the incursion into Russia seems to have been the work of an entire battalion of Ukrainian troops. That's about 500 men in total. It doesn't seem to have made any significant progress at all. It seems to have been engaged almost immediately by border guard troops and National Guard troops and police troops right on the border itself. They seem to have been able to hold it there, this battalion. And Russian regular forces were brought rapidly to the area, including, by the way, the Russian Air Force. General Lapin, about whom we've heard a great deal, he was one of the two Russian commanders, Surovikin was the other, that captured Lysychansk and Severodonetsk last summer. And he was also responsible for rescuing the Russian garrison from Liman in the autumn, when Liman was very close to being surrounded by the Ukrainian forces during their counteroffensive in the Kharkiv region in the autumn. And then Lapin was the target of some criticism by Ramzan Kadyrov, who seems to have misunderstood Lapin's exact role in that particular battle in Liman. And he was also criticized by Prigozhin at that time. Anyway, Lapin was briefly relieved of his command, given a post in Moscow, then after a quiet interval brought back into the theatre. He now seems to be a area commander covering the northern approaches, the northern part of the battlefront, where of course has already had considerable experience. Anyway, he rushed to Belgorod with some troops, and he was able to push the Ukrainian forces out of Russian territory within a few hours with the troops that he had at his disposal. And these Russian regular army troops, with the Air Force, the Russian Air Force also operating, by all accounts, they seem to have inflicted heavy losses on this Ukrainian force, around 70 men, according to the Russian Defense Ministry, killed. Ukrainian troops were killed. There's no reports of any Russian losses whatsoever. And as I discussed at some length yesterday, there's all these pictures of burnt out American vehicles at the scene of the fight, which shows how badly knocked about the Ukrainian forces were. So a whole battalion, and in this attack, it lost the equivalent of a company. It seems completely illogical, but there is one sense in which I do understand Podolyak's comment that the offensive is already underway, because perhaps more important than the military activity in which the Ukrainians engaged, which was completely unsuccessful, there was a massive information attack. Bogus channels, phony channels were created. All sorts of stories were circulated over the internet, some of them picked up by the Russian media, about helicopters, Russian helicopters being shot down, about all sorts of towns and settlements across Belgorod region supposedly were simultaneously attacked. The impression was given for several hours that this was a major incursion and that it had gained quite a lot of ground, that it had not in fact just been held at what was essentially a small village on the border with a border checkpoint. So this was a major information attack, and it did have some success. There was a lot of panic and uncertainty. Well, panic perhaps is too strong a word, but there was a lot of uncertainty and confusion in the rear on the Russian side as to exactly what was going on. The civilian population was alarmed. There were lots of Ukrainian drones operating over the area, dropping small bomblets and grenades, giving the impression that fighting is going on in many places. And I have to say, all of this does look to me like a test run for what will happen when the Ukrainian offensive, the proper Ukrainian offensive itself, does get underway. Now, to repeat again, there's been discussions, both in the American media, one of them important one in foreign policy, but in several other places as well, that the Ukrainians have to break through the Russian defense lines very quickly. They've only got enough ammunition. I'll come to the topic of ammunition. They've only got enough ammunition and enough equipment to sustain the offensive for a limited amount of time, and that the way that they hope to do this is by panicking and paralyzing the Russian leadership and creating panic amongst Russian troops. And the offensive itself, military activity, is probably unlikely to achieve that, but this information attack would seem to fit in very well with the thinking behind all those reports that, as I said, creating panic, creating alarm and fear amongst the Russian military, amongst the Russian political leadership, amongst the Russian population, is part of the plan. So we can perhaps just about see how this attack on Belgorod might have been intended to rehearse some of these techniques, which we're probably likely to see a great deal more of in the next few days, weeks, months, whenever it is that this offensive properly gets underway. I would say that it doesn't seem to have worked in military terms, in terms of the fighting in Belgorod. Now, the Russians have published pictures, which I have no reason to doubt are real pictures, of trenches, an attempt to create, by Ukrainian troops, an attempt to create trenches in this one border village with its border checkpoint, that they did briefly contest. It seems they never fully occupied it. And the fact that they were trying to create trenches and establish some kind of fortified positions there, obviously, as many Russian commentators, including, well, I don't think he is Russian, but Simpliki is the thinker as well, have pointed out, they were clearly intended to try to dig in and to hold positions in this village and to draw perhaps more Russian reinforcements into the area, weakening other fronts, perhaps fronts where the actual offensive might be expected to take place. But anyway, also obviously by occupying this border village to compound the propaganda effect if this battle in this village were to take place for more than a few days. So you could start to see some of the thinking here and get a sense of perhaps what it is that the Ukrainians want to do. Now, I have to say this, there is no doubt at all that all this information attack did create a certain effect. And the same was true, by the way, some weeks ago, 2 weeks ago, when Ukraine launched its counterattack in the Bakhmut area on the flanks. There was again a flood of stories, reports. There was claims that Avdeyevka itself had been, one of the villages, important villages near Bakhmut, had been captured, that Russian forces had fled, all those sort of things. But anyway, there's lots of those kind of reports circulating, floating around, and there's no doubt at all that it did create a certain panic on the Russian side, on the Russian Telegram channels, among Russian military bloggers, amongst, well, I'm not sure to what extent the civilian population, but anyway, there were some stirrings of alarm. And clearly, this partly reflects the way in which some Russian commentators have been unnerved by the events of the autumn, when the Russians were indeed on the back foot for a time as a result of the Ukrainian offensives in the autumn, and some of that's carried over up to now, with the Russians, some Russians still worried that the events of the autumn might repeat themselves. So there's one can just about see the logic of this approach. I have to say that it does seem to me a curious way to fight war. I mean, I accept that information war is part of war. That you know, creating diversions, trying to create panic in the enemy, does play a role in any war. But I wonder whether any regular military, appears to have invested so much in this as the Ukrainian military has done. But there we go. So just to round that episode off, it was entirely unsuccessful. It resulted in heavy loss of life by Ukraine. Podolyak, however, is talking about this all as being the start of the offensive, the Ukrainian offensive, and we can see to some extent how that might be true, how this event might fit into the plans for this offensive, even if the reality is that it is the Russians at the moment who are advancing both in the Bakhmut or Artyomovsk area or around Siversk. And there's also, by the way, been reports that they've made significant further advances in the Avdeyevka area, getting closer now to encircling that particular town close to Donetsk city, which is the main anchor of the Ukrainian forces, which have been trying to lay siege to Donetsk city ever since the conflict began in 2014. Now, on the topic of the offensive, there's two very interesting pieces of news. The first is from the Wall Street Journal, which says that South Korea is now quietly transferring hundreds of thousands of 155mm shells to Ukraine. Now, this is exactly as I and Brian Beletic anticipated. That report that South Korea was going to supply 500,000 shells to the United States to replace depleted US arsenals. We both speculated that the real purpose was to transfer these shells to Ukraine in advance of its offensive, and that is precisely what seems to be happening. At the same time as that's going on, and we're talking about hundreds of thousands of shells, enough probably to sustain the offensive for a couple of weeks. But at the same time as that is happening, we've also had some information from the Pentagon from the US government, the US authorities, about Russian shell production. And we are told that it is now something in the region of 2 million rounds of ammunition, 1.7 million rounds of ammunition last year. That figure has now increased. The United States appears to believe that the Russians will produce something like 2.5 million shells this year, which is a lot of shells. And somebody, I think it was Simplicius the thinker, worked out that according to the figures that the United States is providing, that translates at the moment to something like 200,000 shells that the Russian military is producing each month. Now, that compares with the 15 to 20,000 shells a month, which is what the United States is producing. The European Union can manage around 14 to 15,000. So the Russians undoubtedly are producing many more shells than the Western powers are. And these are now US figures. Now, that already, even if one takes into account the South Korean shells which are being supplied to Ukraine, and which will, as I said, provide Ukraine with a sufficiency of shells for, I suspect, several weeks, it still means that the underlying problem with shells has not been resolved. It's like drawing money. What the West is basically doing is it's drawing money from its bank account much faster than it can put money back in. It's already probably in overdraft in terms of its own stocks of shells. It's now having to borrow shells from its allies, from South Korea. But South Korea will also need shells, given the enormous military forces in the north, in North Korea. And besides, one does wonder to what extent South Korea can substitute for the US. I doubt that South Korea itself has either stocks of shells or shell production capacities that could match those that we're seeing coming out of Russia at the moment. So there we go. So we see that the shell problem is intensifying, and we also see that the production of shells in Russia is on a rising curve. Now, Simplicius the thinker points out that 200,000 shells a month, which is what the Russians, he estimates, are producing, with the Russians firing around 20,000 shells a day, that still doesn't cover their full needs. They would still need, well, they would need many more shells. It's just 10 days of use. The Russians do have large stockpiles of shells, probably much greater stockpiles of shells than the West does. I remember reading some time ago back in the Financial Times that at the start of the war, the Russians had a stockpile of around 19 million shells. They'd used allegedly something like 9 million in 2022. Obviously, they produced 1.7 million. So not all of that was taken from the stockpile. This year, they produced another 2 million. But certainly, if they're drawing shells from their existing stockpile, that is clearly depleting as well. But Simplicius, the thinker, thinks that they're planning to increase shell production even more. And he anticipates that ultimately, shell production in Russia will probably rise to around 6 to 7 million rounds a year. And I think probably that is about right. That's my own guess too. If I was to make a guess, based on, as I said, the factory spaces which I have seen, I think that is perfectly plausible. So 2.5 million rounds of shells is probably the Pentagon's guesstimate based on Russian shell production a few months back. But I suspect that that's already, we're now clearly in a rising curve. I'm guessing that, as I said, we're probably going to see shell production rise well above those levels. And anyway, in brief, I don't expect the Russians at any point soon to run out of shells. The Ukraine, by the way, has now quietly admitted that in terms of missile production, Russia is indeed producing around 100 missiles a month. Again, I suspect that has probably been exceeded by now, probably significantly exceeded. And there's been some other reports, and these do seem to come from Russia, and they need to be taken with considerable care. One Russian tank factory, I think it's the one in Chelyabinsk, has said that it is now producing more tank engines than it did even during the later years of the Soviet Union, which is a very large number of tank engines. Soviet tank production was enormous. And the second report is one which I've seen which suggests that production of the T90M at Uralvagonzavod is now running at 100 units a month. Now, there's previously been long discussions, myself, Brian Beletic, about the levels of Russian tank production. Putin actually says that he provided, that Russia was producing 1,500 tanks, new and refurbished, a year. Well, if this figure of 100 new tanks a month, T90Ms, is true, then that would be logically somewhere in the region, a production output now of 1,200 new tanks a month, never mind the refurbished ones. I'm not convinced that these are accurate figures, so let's just wait and see. But certainly there does seem to be a significant spike in Russian tank production. And of course, the Russians are now using lots of other weapons as well, which I'm not going to discuss in detail. It seems that there's a new Russian self-propelled howitzer, the Malva, which is coming into service, which is long-ranged, comparable in some ways to the French Caesar howitzer. Well, those people who are interested in all of this can follow this in more detail. But there's also been more reports about the extraordinary effectiveness of Russian electronic warfare systems. And one report, which I think must be authoritative since it must originate with Ukrainian sources, which has been republished by the British Royal United Services Institute, speaks of Ukraine losing 10,000 drones a month. 10,000 drones a month. Now, the vast bulk of these are being lost to Russian electronic warfare interference. The Russians are jamming the connections, causing these drones to fail. Now, the vast majority of these drones are small commercial drones being adapted by Ukraine for military use. To my mind, what this figure shows is the enormous extent to which this war is revolving around drones, the importance of drones in this war, but of course it also highlights again the effectiveness of Russian electronic warfare systems and the extent to which Ukraine is losing drones. Now, I have to say, 10,000 drones a month, I wonder to what extent Ukraine, even with the backing of the West, can go on supplying itself, producing drones, deploying drones on the battlefields. I would have thought this was ultimately an impossible challenge given the extent, the size of the losses. But anyway, I won't go into this in further detail. Now, so there's been this important piece of news about the Ukrainian offensive. I think we can, as I said, call this authoritative. South Korea is providing drones, shells to Ukraine. The Russians have ramped up shell production, tank production, and are continuing to do so to extreme, enormous degrees. But anyway, that's going on. The other piece of news relates to the mystery of what's happened to the Ukrainian commander-in-chief of the Ukrainian military, General Zaluzhny. Now, he has been invisible for around 2 weeks now. I think the last confirmed sighting of him was on the 2nd of May. A short time ago, there was a YouTube clip which appeared to show him attending a science conference in Odessa, only it's been suggested that this particular clip actually isn't reliable either, and one shouldn't place any weight on him. Now, yesterday, the Russian media reported that the Russians have received information from Ukrainian sources that Zaluzhny was caught in shelling in Kherson region, that he suffered head injuries, that he was taken to Ukraine, to Kiev, that he received surgery for those injuries to his head, that he's survived, that he's not dead, but that these injuries, compounding a pre-existing diabetes condition, mean that he's no longer capable of leading the Ukrainian military and cannot therefore oversee this offensive. Now, the Russian intelligence chief, Sergei Narishkin, made a public statement about these rumors. He said that the Russians are indeed getting rumors about Zaluzhny's condition, but he said that they cannot be fully confirmed. There's no certainty that these are 100% reliable. And the secretary of Ukraine's National Security and Defense Council, Danilov, has categorically denied them. He has said that Zaluzhny is well, that he actually turned up for work at the military headquarters yesterday, that these reports that are appearing in the Russian media are simply a Russian disinformation exercise. Well, up to this point, I have myself somewhat discounted these reports about Zaluzhny's condition. The reports we were getting yesterday seemed to me to be just that mite more substantive than some of the earlier reports we've seen and heard. And I'm starting to have doubts myself about Zaluzhny. He has been invisible for 2 weeks now. He was somebody who previously made a point of making himself very visible indeed, very different from Russian commanders like Gerasimov and Surovikin and the rest. And as I said, this long period, this long stretch of invisibility is unusual. Now, if this goes on for very much longer, then I'm going to start giving credence to these Russian reports, and I suspect people in Ukraine are going to start doing the same. We're not, I think, fully there yet, but we will see. Now, can I reiterate, however, that even if Zaluzhny is out of action, I don't expect it to interfere significantly with Ukrainian planning for this offensive. I don't expect that it will prevent Ukraine from launching this offensive. I suspect much of the planning is not being done in Ukraine anyway, but in NATO headquarters and other places. What it might do, if it is confirmed that Zaluzhny is severely injured and is no longer in effective command, what it might do is affect the morale of Ukrainian soldiers. And for all I know, that might be why, if he is indeed injured, if he is indeed wounded, the Ukrainians are concealing him. So what else has been happening? There was another rather curious attack by Ukraine on a Russian warship, which is patrolling the Turk Stream pipeline under the Black Sea. This warship, relatively far, it must be said, from the battle area, and not by any means a particularly powerful warship. It's not one of these warships. It's not an Admiral Makarov frigate or anything like that. Anyway, this particular warship was attacked by Ukraine's seaborne drones. The drones were spotted by the ship's air systems, and they were all destroyed. So we're told by the Russians, and in fact, there's no doubt at all about this. With heavy cannon firing at these drones from the ship. None of these drones, these seaborne drones, got through. All of them were destroyed. The ship is there, and I have to say that this attempt to attack a warship patrolling the Turk Stream pipeline, I suspect, is not going to please one particular person, who is, of course, President Erdogan of Turkey, for whom Turk Stream was a particular personal project. It's not an attack on the pipeline itself, but that warship was guarding the pipeline, and I can't imagine that Erdogan is going to be pleased at all. I get the sense, by the way, that Erdogan, who's now had the endorsement of the third place candidate in the Turkish election, and who looks increasingly certain of re-election on the 28th of May in the election runoff, I suspect that Erdogan has had it up to there with Ukraine. I think he's exasperated by Ukraine's behavior over the grain extension, their refusal to acknowledge that there are concerns about blocks on Russian grain exports. And I think that this attack on a warship, a Russian warship, not engaged in the actual conflict, but protecting the Turk Stream pipeline, is not going to please him at all, particularly as this attack seems to have happened not far from the Bosphorus, in other words, from Turkish waters. So I think this was a misconceived operation altogether. I wonder, by the way, whether it wasn't in some way connected with the Turkish election, perhaps intending to create some kind of an incident in advance of the voting on the 28th of May, perhaps try to panic Erdogan into some sort of overreaction, or give the Turkish people a sense that if Erdogan was elected, their country might in some way be dragged into the war. Anyway, whatever the thinking was, the one thing I can say with certainty, with confidence, is that Erdogan won't be pleased. Now, another country is pretending that it is unhappy with some of the events which Ukraine is taking. So there's been a report in the New York Times that the United States has once again determined that the drone attacks on the Kremlin were indeed the work of a Ukrainian intelligence agency, that we are told that the mighty United States is unable to establish which one, which of course begs the question of how many intelligence agencies does Ukraine actually have. Remember, it's a middle-ranking power, not exactly a very wealthy country. Obviously, it's received an awful lot of money from the West, but does it really have a multiplicity of intelligence agencies? The New York Times story also says that the United States isn't sure whether President Zelensky himself had any role in the affair, given the Pentagon leaks, which showed what a belligerent individual Zelensky is, how, for example, he is obsessed with the capture of Russian villages in Belgorod and Kursk and Bryansk regions, with the plan apparently to try to trade them for Ukrainian territory. The fact that he comes up with these crazy schemes. Why do they assume that Zelensky might not be involved? Personally, the fact that he was in Finland on the day that there was an attack on the Kremlin, the fact that he suddenly materialized in Finland without any prior notice, to my mind, that is a very strong sign that he was absolutely fully informed and aware that this attack on the Kremlin was going to take place, and wanted to stay out of Kiev in case the attack was successful and triggered some kind of Russian retaliation. So that's the one news report from the New York Times. It says that the United States wasn't happy with this incident. It considers it another one of those examples of Ukraine doing crazy and stupid and counterproductive things which the United States disapproves of. Except, of course, as I've said previously, the United States disapproves of these episodes, these actions, and does nothing about them, except signal its disapproval with these leaks in the US media. And then we've had a whole series of very complicated reports about the Belgorod affair, also from the United States. We're told that the United States hasn't yet established whether it was indeed American vehicles that were used in the attack on Belgorod. We've seen the pictures. They're speculating that these pictures might have been staged. It doesn't seem very likely. In fact, it doesn't seem likely at all. But anyway, we've had attempts to try and pretend that this might not be the case. We've also seen reports that the United States would disapprove of Ukraine transferring these vehicles to a third party. Who this third party is alleged to be goes unstated, but presumably it is this Russian anti-partisan group which Ukraine continues to pretend carried out this attack on Belgorod. I don't think anybody who studied that incident in any detail believes that. But anyway, once again, we're asked to believe that the United States is unhappy with this episode. Except, again, if the United States is genuinely unhappy, it has a very strange way of showing it, because it does nothing at all to make public its disapproval other than plant these strategic leaks in the media. And it goes on arming Ukraine regardless, making itself in effect complicit in this activity of which it disapproves. Now, I've already made clear the further damage that this is doing to US-Russian relations. I mean, the Russians see all of this. They must find this American response to incidents like this a further case of US duplicity. I know many people, including many people in Russia, and I wouldn't at all be surprised members of the Russian government, believe that the United States is actually directly involved and implicated in some of these attacks. But put that aside, I think that perhaps, almost certainly, there are people in the United States who are genuinely unhappy about attacks of this kind. And for all I know, it is they who are leaking this information to the media. I've already discussed how there seems to be a genuine debate underway within the US political and military establishment, arguing over whether or not to sustain this war, arguing that the war is not sustainable, does not work well for the United States in the long term. And perhaps these people are highlighting the flakiness of the Kiev government, the fact that it does outrageous and crazy and reckless and dangerous things, and that the United States should not therefore be involved in it. It might not be a coincidence that there's also reports now coming out of Germany, which again appear to be intended simultaneously with all of this to revive the story that Ukraine was involved or carried out the attack on the Nord Stream pipelines. So I think that there is this internal debate probably going on in the United States, and for all I know, eventually, when that debate is resolved in favor of the realists, if it is resolved in favor of the realists will be able to point to all of these incidents and highlight the fact that they've already been reported in the US media as part of the challenge they intend to make to the neocons, pointing out to the American people how dangerous and reckless the neocons are. But let me reiterate again, unless and until that happens, these American denials spread in the media in the way that they are, American denials of direct responsibility, statements of American disapproval of Ukrainian actions, far from assuaging the Russians, are, I suspect, in fact I am sure, simply heightening Russian distrust. They must be seeing that the Americans say all of this, even as incidents like this continue to happen. And that must make the Russians even more sure that negotiations between them and the United States, be it over Ukraine, over any other matter, are simply impossible, especially whilst this administration remains in office. Now, I say all of that There have been further attempts by China, especially at the moment, to try to get negotiations underway. Li Hui is on his travels. He's been to Europe. As I said, he's going to eventually go to Moscow. He's traveling around various places. But for the moment, I have to say, there's no sign of negotiations at all. I can't imagine we're going to see negotiations, substantive negotiations, take place this side of any Ukrainian offensive. Of course, if Ukraine postpones this offensive for too long, there is a real risk and possibility that the Russians will eventually lose patience and preempt it and launch an offensive of their own. And of course, we've now had reports that the Russians are indeed anyway planning some kind of Russian counterstrike after the offensive fails, and that the soldiers, the Russian soldiers, far from being demoralized and exhausted, are itching to go on the attack. Now, I ought to just, before proceeding further with a few more diplomatic points, just say that I've had more information on the casualty figures that Prigozhin was talking about. Again, this comes from a source close to Wagner. This person essentially confirms Prigozhin's figure of about 5,000 casualties suffered by the Wagner organization over the course of the entire fighting, lasting around a year, around the better part, 10 months or so, around the Bakhmut area. This source also says that when Prigozhin says that 50,000 Wagner troops participated in the fight for Bakhmut, this is not a figure of the number of troops that the Wagner organization had at any one time in the Bakhmut area. It might include every single person who fought with the Wagner organization, professional people who fought with the Wagner organization over the course of the 10 months. That might amount to about 50,000. But the real number of Wagner troops who were engaged at any particular point in the fight was significantly lower than that, perhaps around 26 to 30,000. Now, on Ukrainian losses, this source estimates them slightly lower than what Prigozhin says, and makes no reference to the numbers of convicts that Prigozhin is talking about. Now, there's been a very, very interesting discussion of all this issue of Prigozhin's claims about losses, again, by Simplicius the Thinker. And essentially, Simplicius the Thinker is even more skeptical of Prigozhin's figures. And he does make the point that Prigozhin has made some absolutely bizarre claims about the size of the Ukrainian forces, saying that, making the claim that Ukraine is militarizing, that its number of tanks have increased from 500 at the start of the war to 5,000 now, which is obviously absurd. No one else has suggested any kind of figure like that. 5,000 tanks would be an enormous tank force, far bigger than either side has deployed to this conflict zone. And that, the Ukrainian army has increased from 20,000 to 400,000 or something like that. Simplicius the Thinker thinks that Prigozhin once again is clearly acting out some kind of agenda. For all I know, he's right. All I will say is all of this makes me a little even more skeptical about some of his claims and some of his numbers than I've suggested in the past. But 5,000 men lost by the Wagner organization over the last 10 months is probably about right, killed in action. So it seems. The 10,000 convicts who've died, I think we can disregard unless we get more corroboration of this. Ukrainian losses, between 30 and 50,000 killed in the fighting in Bakhmut. That does seem to be a reasonable estimate based now on a multiplicity of sources. So there we go. That's what I wanted to say about the situation on the battlefields. There's lots of other news. Apparently a Russian surface-to-air missile system has been busy shooting down Ukrainian planes entirely autonomously without any human intervention using AI technology. Well, that's more for the sort of people who take an interest in these kind of things and who know more about these kind of things than me to discuss. It all seems rather frightening to me, but anyway, I leave it, as I said, I leave that kind of topic to be discussed by others. Meanwhile, there have been more things, as I said, of a diplomatic nature going on. And yesterday I was talking about the fact that the Russian Prime Minister, Mr. Mishustin, has been in China, about his meeting with Xi Jinping. I talked about the fact that the head of the Russian Navy had been visiting Iran, and that Dmitry Medvedev, the deputy head of Russia's Security Council, and the man in overall charge of Russia's military industries, and the man who is ultimately responsible, by the way, for this enormous surge in arms production in Russia, Dmitry Medvedev, that he's just been to Vietnam and had a friendly and successful visit there. One other important Russian, has been on her travels, and that is none other than Elvira Nabiullina, the head of the Russian Central Bank. And she, presumably together with the head of the Russian Navy, I'd be interested to know whether they travelled on the same aircraft, has been to Iran. And she's had meetings with the Iranian finance people, the central bank people, the finance people. And it's clearly all about connecting Iran's financial system, with the Russian and establishing linkages, extending the Russian SWIFT alternative to Iran too. And it's been these developments of this sudden forging, coming together of this relationship between Russia and Iran has been a little surprising to me, because it had been assumed that of the two Eurasian powers, it would be China that Iran would be forging the deeper economic links with. But for the moment, it seems to be the Russians who are actually making the major moves. It's they who are building rail and sea links across the Caspian Sea to Iran, who are working with the Iranians on developing their gas and energy fields to produce gas and oil to be supplied to India and China, by the way. And it is the Russians, we see this with Nabiullina, who are now in Iran talking about creating these financial linkages, which, by the way, could be a particular game changer if they help Iran to stabilize its currency and finally cure this inflation problem that has been a problem for Iran, well, for decades now. So anyway, she is there, and all of this has happened in conjunction with an important, very important meeting of the Russian-led Eurasian Economic Union, which has just taken place in Moscow chaired by no less a person than Vladimir Putin himself. And again, all the Central Asian leaders were there, with the lead figure being Tokayev, the president of Kazakhstan. And Tokayev, interestingly, said that his overriding priority is Eurasian, the full integration of the Central Eurasian economies with Russia within this Eurasian Economic Union. So we've had a very interesting succession of meetings involving the Central Asian states. Firstly, as we saw, they all turned up to the Victory Day parade in Moscow on the 9th of May. Then they all trooped off to Xi'an, where they met with Xi Jinping. Now they've gone to Moscow. They've had this big meeting with Putin. They're talking about integration, economic integration with Russia. I wonder whether what the agenda here is, whether we aren't seeing all the economic linkages, which go back, of course, to the Soviet times, between the Central Asian states and Russia, being reactivated, but with China acting, if you like, as the banker for this entire process, making sure that its own economic interests are secured and indeed extended, and playing a role, if you like, in integrating this entire area, strengthening, of course, its own position, but indirectly Russia's also, and thereby strengthening this bloc that is being created. These are all complex moves. They're not entirely easy to read, but it does seem as if Iran is also in for the ride, perhaps Afghanistan too, conceivably after Erdogan is re-elected, on the assumption that he is re-elected, Erdogan also. So all very interesting, and that brings me to the last topic of this video, a particularly absurd one, and it comes from my old friend Con Coughlin, who writes for the Daily Telegraph. There's been lots of rumours that Con Coughlin has connections with various agencies of the British government, something which, by the way, I can't confirm. But he is, in my experience, a reliable voice for what the British establishment is either thinking or wants other people to think. Anyway, he's written a long piece about how Russia is incapable of defending its borders. This is all based upon the Belgorod incident, which he seems remarkably ill-informed about. He still thinks it's anti-Russian partisans. He thinks it's likely that these American vehicles that we've seen burnt out, that these are staged. He continues to think that. But then he tells us that the Russian military is now so depleted that it can't defend Russian borders. And he finishes with these really very astonishing words. He says that the need to bolster its depleted fighting units has seen Moscow withdraw a substantial number of its forces from border regions in the north and east. And then he talks about the fact that there's no longer any risk of the Russians advancing on Estonia, something which the Russians have never shown the slightest interest in doing. But let's put that aside. He then goes on to say, this, for me, is the most extraordinary passage in this article of all. And bear in mind, it's in the Daily Telegraph, mainstream media in Britain, as mainstream as it gets, better than some in its coverage of the war, I should say. I mean, I would actually rate the Daily Telegraph as better, for example, than The Guardian or even the Financial Times. Anyway, this is what he says. The withdrawal of Russian forces in the east is potentially even more problematic, as it opens the way for China to revise its long-held territorial ambitions, especially concerning Siberia's mighty forests. Residents of Siberia's Irkutsk and Krasnoyarsk regions have protested against the activities of Chinese timber firms, which rely heavily on Russia to meet the demands of China's rapidly expanding market for wood. Xi Jinping might have positioned Beijing as a key Russian ally in the Ukraine conflict, but his real interest may lie in reasserting Chinese control over disputed territory with Russia. Not so long ago, in the 1960s to be precise, Russia and China went to war. They didn't. They had some border clashes over a land dispute in eastern Russia. But there would be no need for Xi to become involved in a military conflict with Moscow if, as happened with Ukraine, Moscow no longer has control over its borders. Now, all of this is written at the same time as the Chinese president, Xi Jinping, is meeting the Russian Prime Minister, Mishustin. They're discussing enhanced economic cooperation. Russian-Chinese trade is going to hit a record, which it might hit a record and might surpass that record very soon. We've had the Chinese leader talking to the Central Asian states. We have the Central Asian states trooping off to Moscow, meeting Putin twice. None of this, of course, is mentioned in this article. Apparently, I haven't seen any reports about this, but perhaps Con Coughlin is right. Some people in the Far Eastern regions might be a bit concerned that China is getting too much wood. But the meetings between the Prime Minister of Russia, the President of China, the leaders of the Central Asian states, this meeting of this Eurasian Economic Union, Putin's chairmanship of it, none of that is mentioned here. Just these fantasies of the Chinese army sweeping into Siberia and taking control of its mighty forests. This isn't journalism. This isn't, I don't know even what it is exactly. Well, it's story. I mean, it's not even propaganda properly. It's story making. It's storytelling. It's not based on any fact. It's completely bizarre to me that this gets written. And what it goes to show is how hopelessly ill-informed the Western public now is. Well, thank you for joining me again today. There'll be more from me soon. Just to remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various channels, Locals, Rumble, BitChute, ODYSEE, Rockfin, Telegram. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Go to our shop, see the links below. To remind you again, that's the only place you will find any merchandise that has any connection to me. Anything else that you see being sold anywhere has nothing to do with me at all. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. And thank you for joining me again today.